So we've noticed a lot of traffic on our website related to the Gabriel Fernandez case. There's a new documentary coming out on Netflix, and so we just thought we'd kind of offer some information to the public about not only this case, but these cases in general, these types of cases. Our law firm specializes in representing kids who've been abused. In situations like this, we've had successful cases against Child Protective Services agencies, and so we just thought we would share some information about how this happens, why it happens, how it could be prevented, so that's what we want to talk about.
Yeah, when I was in law school, I clerked for a period of a couple months at the Children's Law Center, and I actually worked on Gabriel's case at that time. He has siblings that were brought into the dependency system, and I was working with them right after their brother died. So that would have been, I guess, summer of 2013. And we wish that this was a one-time thing and that it was an unusual occurrence, but unfortunately we've seen over and over again that these things can be somewhat frequent, and the goal is to talk about why this is happening and how it can be stopped.
So the way this happens is if someone thinks that a child is being abused, they make a report either to Child Protective Services or to the police. And that kind of sets the ball in motion. And then what's supposed to happen is that Child Protective Services, or CPS, social workers, are supposed to go out to the home, interview the child, interview the parents, and they're supposed to basically get to the bottom of what happened and decide what action is necessary to protect the child. Unfortunately, we've seen cases, and the Fernandez case is one example, we've seen a number of other examples, where the social workers sort of go through the motions of doing an investigation, but nothing happens. And the kid is no better off from the fact that social workers have come to the home and interviewed him. Sometimes the kids are worse off, because what happens is that the people that are committing this abuse, they see the system get involved, they see social workers come to the house, but when nothing happens, they feel like, well, they've been exonerated, and so it can sometimes make it worse.
I think another way that it gets worse is the children have done what we always ask children to do, which is if you're being abused, tell an adult. They go forward and tell an adult, which is a very hard thing to do if you're being abused. And then social workers or law enforcement come to the house. When those children are left in the home, now they're left with their parents who are abusing them, who now know that they're telling other people. And so then I think there's sometimes a crackdown, basically. The abuse worsens, and the child's silence worsens as a result of that. So the child is not as willing or likely to then tell another adult in the future if the abuse is continuing. So if, as we often see, the social workers come back in a few months for another referral, at that point usually the child says nothing's happening and I'm fine, because the first time, their lives went from bad to much worse after CPS or law enforcement got involved.
And too often what we've seen is social workers who just accept the child recanting, changing his story, and using that to argue that they should close their file and walk away. And if you ask any child psychologist, they'll tell you that in fact it's very, very common for kids to change their story, because, as Carly just said, they told the story initially, nothing happened, or their situation got worse. So the lesson they've learned is there's no value in telling people about this. In fact, I'm better off if I deny that it happened, because then my parent or whoever's, you know, doing this abuse will not take it out on me. So.
And one, to share an example of a case that we've worked on that we settled last year, involving recantation and all of that, we had a young girl who said that her mother's live-in boyfriend was raping her. She told a teacher, who then got CPS and law enforcement involved. It looked like the boyfriend had left the country. That's what mom said. Mom got a restraining order against the boyfriend. CPS said, okay, it looks like everything is fine here. But it was 4 months later, CPS came back to the house on an unrelated issue, and the boyfriend was living there. And they didn't bother to do anything. They didn't call the police, which they're required to do. And they asked our young child, who was 11 at the time, is he still bothering you? And she said, no, everything's fine. And they just let it go for 2 years until she became pregnant with his child at age 13 and had to have a baby and give it up for adoption. And they just relied heavily, and I want to say almost exclusively, on the fact that she had recanted, which the fact that she recanted should not be surprising to anyone.
Right, so that's something we've seen a lot. We've also seen where if there's any sort of resistance, the social workers will just give up. So for example, if the parents just stop cooperating, parents say, we're not going to talk to you, we're not going to do what you ask us to do, we're just not doing anything. You think that would make the situation more dangerous, and there's more need for social workers to do something. But what we've seen in cases is just the opposite. They'll close their file and say, well, we're not getting any cooperation, we can't do anything.
And in those cases, over and over, we've seen the same thing, where when the parents fail to cooperate, CPSS will say, well, we tried, the parents won't cooperate, they walk away, and in many of those cases, the child ends up dead. And so we're handling numerous cases right now involving deceased children, where CPS, not unlike the Gabriel Fernandez case, where CPS was involved, and when the parents said, we'd rather not have CPS involved in our house, CPS walked out the door, but that child was left there, again, in that situation where now the parents know that they've been leaking the family secrets, and those children ended up being murdered.
I mean, there's basically, in situations like this, there's a few options that the social workers have. First of all, they're supposed to do a thorough investigation, and in some cases they conclude, and in some cases it's reasonable to conclude, that the child is not being abused or neglected. There are cases where they think there's some abuse or neglect, but they think that there's the potential for the parents to change what they're doing and to benefit from classes and things like that. And so sometimes those kinds of services are offered. And then there's the cases where the situation is just too dangerous for the child, and the child needs to be removed from the family. And the social workers have a certain amount of discretion in deciding what category a particular case falls into. But you see a case like the Fernandez case, or some of the cases we've handled, where it's just so clear that something needs to be done. Police need to be brought in, or the child needs to be removed from the parents, or something along those lines, and they just don't do anything. They look for an excuse to close their file and kind of be done with it.
I mean, we have a case in Riverside right now where they went into the home and substantiated physical abuse allegations, meaning the social workers said, okay, this child is being physically abused, but when the dad failed to cooperate, they closed their file, and the dad went on to murder that child.
So, what we've seen, I mean, there's a few different causes of why this happens. One is social workers can be overworked, too many cases. I think sometimes they get jaded. They see so much terrible stuff that they kind of get numb to it, and the cases where they really need to intervene and do something just get lost in the shuffle. And then I think a lot of it is a lack of leadership. There needs to be a message sent from the top of the agency that we're here to protect kids. I mean, it's called Child Protective Services, right? It's in the name, the fact that the reason this agency exists is to protect kids. But if the leadership of the agency isn't sending that message and isn't telling the social workers, look, you're not going to get punished if you err on the side of protecting kids, and if that message isn't sent, then what we've seen is that it's just so easy for social workers to take the easy way out. When you remove a child from their parents, sometimes the parents object to that. Sometimes there's lawsuits filed. It's not always an easy route, but oftentimes it's the correct thing to do.
So what we've learned in our cases is 10 or 15 years ago, there were a number of parents were filing civil rights lawsuits because they were arguing that their children had been taken from their home without a warrant, and that was inappropriate, and the children were inappropriately removed. And in response to that, some counties have swung the pendulum in the opposite direction. So because they were getting sued for removing kids wrongfully, now they just don't remove kids at all, because they're trying to avoid those lawsuits. And so it has swung from, okay, we're going to be overprotective and make sure the children are protected, to essentially being overprotective of the parents instead of the children. And obviously, as we know from Gabriel's case and from so many other cases, these social workers that are coming into the house are sometimes that child's only lifeline. And if the social workers are more concerned about the parents than the child, and they choose to walk out the door, that kid is often just left on their own.
So, if you look at how things can improve, what can be done about this problem, I think there's a few things. I think we mentioned leadership already, that these agencies need to be sending the message to the rank and file social workers that you're when in doubt, do what's best for the child, and don't gamble with the child's life in many cases. So that's important. And there has to be some accountability. We've done a number of lawsuits against counties involving CPS agencies, and those cases make a difference when the county understands that there's a price to be paid for not protecting kids. Then they're going to be more likely to change the way they do things. And so I think it's important, and there's some things that can change in the law. We're not going to get into a lot of detail about that here, but there's certainly some things that can change to make social workers' duties and obligations more clear, and to make them more accountable when they mess up. So I think that's very important.
Sure, and barring a change in the law, which so far has not been forthcoming, these lawsuits that communicate to the county that it's more expensive for you to do it wrong are important. And we have seen some of the lawsuits that we have filed result in changes within the leadership in various counties. So that's one way to get the message out to the counties that us and the public are serious about protecting these kids. And then of course the other way is publicity, which we're seeing a lot of with the trials of Gabriel Fernandez and the documentary that's come out, And it's important that we talk about what's happened to these kids, and acknowledge what happened to them and ask the question, how can we do better for these little guys?